Welcome to Advent Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida. Rebecca and Gina, thank you for being with us today. Matthew mentions 4 women in Jesus' lineage other than his mother, and it's highly unusual in the histories and the sacred texts of that time for women to be mentioned in a lineage. But 4 of them make it into Matthew's lineage. And we also know that biblical lineages were usually less about genealogy and biological succession than they were about spiritual succession. So we're going to be puzzling out together what Matthew was trying to tell us about, or by mentioning these 4 women. And we're starting with Tamar. Who is Tamar, and where do we meet her in the Bible?
So we meet her in Genesis, right before we meet Joseph, right? We meet her in Genesis 38, and we learn how she was supposed to be a part of Judah's family, and she was spoken for. She married Judah's son, but the Lord found him wicked, and that was the end of and then she was with the next, and then she was given to the next in line, but he did not want to raise sons or descendants for his passed away brother. He didn't want to follow that. So according to the scripture, he would spill his seed on the ground and therefore not impregnate her. And so again, put to the side. And so ultimately she was supposed to wait and wait for Shelah to come of age, and she would marry the 3rd son of Judah. But instead of staying with that family, Judah said, well, go back and live as a widow in your own father's house, which is basically biblical limbo. I mean, biblical times limbo, because to live as a widow, she couldn't marry again. She had no sway within her community. She had no power. She was essentially at the mercy of the male figures in her life, and she was stuck, but she was of marrying age. So that's how we first meet her. And then, as if that all wasn't harsh enough, then we kind of get into the rest of her story. So I don't know how much you want me to narrate of it, but just how she comes onto the scene, I just immediately feel for her that these things are happening outside of her control.
Yeah, so there's this weird, tradition, right? And levirate marriage where brother dies, you know, the brother still needs an heir.
Step in.
So the next brother steps in to try to produce that she had gone through the family basically, and was down to the kid brother who wasn't even marrying age. Just in this.
So she does what a lot of the patriarchs did when they came to the end of the rope. They took their fate into their own hands and believed, this is what I need to do. I was promised this. I want a line, and I want from Judah's line. So she dresses up like a prostitute and sits on the side of the road outside the city where men go by picking up prostitutes, and gets herself in the path of Judah, and he picks her. He forgets what she looks like.
Jacob.
Yeah, because her face was veiled.
Her father-in-law. And so he didn't recognize her. He didn't know who she is. And she gets pregnant. And when she gets pregnant, she then announces this. It's found out. And the very famous verse in Genesis in that regard is, he confessed that he was the father, and that he took responsibility for the greater sin, and absolved her, pretty much. And of course, she had twins, and her oldest, the twin, became the father of Obed, and Boaz, who then became descended to David, and it never would have happened. So she's one of those women who just won't stop. And God, they take matters into her own hands. And it follows with the patriarchs. I mean, God kind of smiles on tricksters. you know, which is always so interesting to me, and how we often forget that.
She reminds me a lot of you, actually, Jean, with the justice work you do in the wedding. No, well, when our officials
Thanks a lot.
promise us something, you hold them
That's
accountable
right.
to
Exactly.
that.
Yeah.
Not
No. I
the same
mean,
way she does.
exactly.
But you hold them accountable to that, and
Right. We're a lot more straightforward than she was, but
yes. But there's something to that, isn't there? That God seems to respond favorably to those who say, you know, I was promised this. I'm gonna get it one way or another.
That's right. Yeah.
Anything you want to add to the story that we missed, Rebecca?
No, I think the only thing that that jumps to mind is before Judah takes it on himself, is that she was accused. You know, she was accused of, you know, being a whore, and how dare you step out, and, you know, she was being shamed. She was being publicly shamed. And then she said, aha, I have proof. You know, it reminds me of that when Nathan approaches David with the story of the man and his lamb. He says, oh, that man. He said, well, you are the man. I'm just reminded when Tamar has the things like, hey, you are the father. You cannot get away from your responsibility and your ownership of this. So, you know.
Yeah, so many women, across history and even today are shamed for their sexuality when suddenly a pregnancy reveals a sexuality that people count on. And yeah, she has this beautiful, I called it in one of the other segments, I called it kind of the Trojan horse moment, but, you know, where, you know, she's being blamed and then all of a sudden, haha, you know, it's actually you.
Does this staff look familiar? Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And the amazing thing, as within some of the other stories in this lineage that Matthew lays out, is that this proud man in the story, rather than rejecting that proof, I mean, he could have deflected, he could have done, I mean, Jean knows all the things powerful people do when they don't want to take responsibility, and he could have done any of those things.
Right.
Yeah.
But he actually does take responsibility, not only for obviously being the father, but for the fact that he had failed to follow through on what he was supposed to do as her father-in-law, and make sure that she was taken care of and had an heir and all of that.
That was true with all those 4 women, that in a very patriarchal, extraordinarily patriarchal society, the only way women, and it was tragic, but they had to use their sexuality to be able to accomplish God's goodwill.
Yeah, they didn't have a lot of social capital. They certainly didn't have financial capital. So,
yeah.
And I think there continue to be in our world today a lot of women who, you know, have very little power other than their sexuality, and remarkable is, rather than condemning that, that's the line that God's going to bring the Messiah out of.
And why do we forget that? You know.
Well, why would Matthew want to connect Jesus to this story? How does this story illuminate who Jesus is going to be as Matthew unfolds his gospel?
I'll be honest, I struggle with this a little bit. I have to wave my white flag on this and just say, I'm not sure. You know, I have a lot of respect for her chutzpah and for Judah, as you pointed out, Pastor Jen, of stepping up. So I see a lot of positive character portrayals, but I'm not sure. So I'm interested in others' ideas.
I think when you look at Matthew's genealogy as opposed to Luke's genealogy, you get clues, because he starts with Abraham and then very quickly moves to the Davidic line. And Matthew's gospel has very quickly, as we were talking about, Israel is no longer, Matthew wants us to see Jesus came for the whole world, not for this closed sect, small religion, that has liberating them. And the model of these Gentile women who adopted the faith of, they were converts, at least two overtly. I can't remember if Tamar expressly, but certainly Ruth and Rahab. And that was part of that message, and that God's line isn't pure, and that's a good thing. And the first people that encountered Jesus after birth in Matthew is not shepherds. It's those Gentile scholars who come from another whole country. So very quickly, Matthew is opening up the gospel that God has come to save everyone.
Which is so interesting, because of the Gospels, Matthew is the one that is geared mostly to his Jewish brethren.
He's speaking very, and this is his first sermon, these women.
Yeah.
It's not about just being pure and closed. It's about how we can still be Jewish and be open.
And it's a good old yes and.
Yeah. I think he was, he hits it hard.
And I think it's a yes and to those who are oftentimes most on the margins. I mean, I think of how religious communities have often marginalized people, and often it is, not those doing these big collective injustice things, like, failing to feed the poor, but it's those, the ones that get marginalized are those who, for whatever reason are deemed sexually not pure or something along those lines for their sexuality, more or less. And it's amazing that Matthew's gospel has all these stories of, people that don't fit in the nice, clean boxes when it comes to sexuality, and kind of break that mold. And yet there's going to be an openness. And then we see that, I'm jumping over to Luke here, but beginning of Acts, the first convert is going to be this Ethiopian eunuch, this other person that doesn't in the boxes just right.
So it takes, I think Matthew's, it takes all kinds, and it's not just the women who cross the boundaries. There's those men who are willing to say, I'm welcome, and why have I just like, that's the so confusing thing about our modern Christianity, for the most part, likes to go back to that exclusion, keep it pure, what their definition of what pure is. And that is particularly around the sexuality, that there's been so little room for grace and openness and understanding.
Well, I think, to speak about those communities who are marginalized, Tamar is an example of speaking truth to power in a very micro setting, right? It's with her, within her own family, within her own life, but we see that example and what it can lead to, because I guess, if we think about Jesus being coming in a surprise package, then we can imagine Tamar as a woman who doesn't have any of this collateral, speaking truth into the situation, and it makes a difference.
Yeah, so Jesus will also be a truth teller, speaking truth to power. And I think of the way, when we were talking about Tamar also kind of claiming what had been promised her. I mean, Jesus on a much more macro level is going to claim what has been promised to God's people and just claim and hold on to it all the way through the cross and the grave. And it just relentlessly hold on to that and not let go. And that really, we see that in Tamar. So he's going to embody that. Well, as we think about the hope and light of Jesus coming into our world, why is it important to connect him to this story?
There are all kinds of things that sort of, I love that it's like God has a real sense of humor. That's hopeful, I mean, who would have expected, somebody dresses up like a prostitute, like sleeps with her father-in-law. It's like, or what Ruth did, in the field with Boaz. I mean, I was just like, whoa, okay. And it's kind of, there's a freeing joyfulness about, in that desperation, you do what you have to do and God blesses that,
Yeah, I think there's a freedom too, and that, there doesn't seem to be one right way to, get to God's promises, that, we're all going to go in some different directions. But if we're pursuing God's promises, God blesses that.
It's a big tent.
Yeah. And I appreciate your use of the word pursuing, because I think there was a real opportunity for Tamar to fade away, right?
It would have been the easy way.
Shelved. It would have, but she held on to the promise, and she held on to the hope of the promise that she would live into a family and she would take her rightful place. And, as I say, like she persevered and she pursued, and she had to truly believe in what was owed to her and what value she had, because it would have been so easy for her to consider herself less than, but she didn't. And that gives me a lot of hope for the way that we can view ourselves and, our own hope for this season and into the future.
Yeah, she could have been married into another family, but she chose to cling and hold on it, and I think about, we sometimes call those at Good Sam spiritual refugees, people who have but there's something beautiful in that I find, at least, in people who may have been very hurt and rejected by these faith families, these faith communities, and yet say, no, this is my faith and I'm going to cling to it anyway. Even though you're not giving me a way forward among you, I'm going to cling to it anyway and keep that promise.
Without these stories of these women who went out of these bounds, it just sets the stage for a Jesus who related to women in outside all the boundaries. He, touched a woman who was the flow of blood, and that allowed that to happen. That would never have happened to, all the different ways that he related to women that were so out of the ordinary. Let a woman wash his feet at the table and blessed her. She may or may not. Mary Magdalene, to allow that to happen. I mean,
and to allow women to learn from him at his feet, to sit at the feet of the rabbi and be taught by him.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it might be Matthew going back, after Jesus' life to some extent and saying, okay, who am I going to include in Jesus' lineage? Well, Jesus did all these things that were so far out of the box. I've got to somehow explain why that's okay.
And
he goes back to these women who were out of the box, but who still played this huge role in what God was doing. Well, thank you both for this wonderful conversation on Tamar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Advent Conversations as we continue on the journey of this season.